Howdy, y'all. Thanks for watching the Stick Figure Historian. Today, we're going to continue our story of Texas, picking up where we left off with Ben Milam's dramatic call to the Texan army. Who will go with Ben Milam into San Antonio? And his call did not go unheard. 300 volunteers flocked to the man with the rifle, standing alone in the midst of the camp. The one man who had the courage to take the risk of storming San Antonio de Bexar. Burleson knew there was no point in trying to go forward with his original winter retreat plan. Fully half of his army was following Milam. His word of approval was given, a thing of little worth one way or another. The Texans would follow Milam, no matter who or what tried to get in their way. And Milam couldn't have picked a better time to take the offensive. The Mexican army in Bexar was rather low in spirits after the long weeks of siege. Idleness is never a good thing for an army. Supplies were beginning to run low as well, and there was nothing to do but to watch the army outside that formed their living prison walls. Milam split his 300 men into two. He led one band, and Frank W. Johnson led the other. You may recall this Johnson as the leader of the band that had come to rescue Travis from Fort Anahuac 3 years before. They charged straight into the outskirts of town, routed the Mexican troops there, and conquered several large houses. Milam planned to use the houses as temporary forts as they continued to make progress toward the heart of the city. When the sun set, the Texans dug ditches around the houses and pulled down the smaller buildings around them. This would make it harder for the Mexicans to drive them back out. The next morning, Milam and his men were up and at it again. Bullets whizzed up and down the streets, from windows, around corners, behind open doors, all with the cannonballs hissing overhead from time to time. It was a wild fight. The Texans were literally winning Bexar a house at a time, a slow and dangerous work. And then, the worst happened. As Milam lifted his telescope to get a better view of a church tower, he was struck by a Mexican bullet. He fell back dead into the arms of one of his faithful followers. But this did not stop the Texans. They had said they would follow Ben Milam to San Antonio, and by George they would keep going, even if that meant without him. It was up to them to finish what he had begun. Johnson took command of his fallen comrades' column, and the attack continued. Step by step, the Mexicans found they were being driven into the heart of Bexar. Ben Milam's wild idea was proving to be perhaps more than General Martin had reckoned it would be. He and his men fought as long as they could, but at last he called them all to rally inside the Alamo. They could defend themselves better there, and if worst came to worst, it would at least buy them some time to work out decent terms with the Texans. Martin's orders reached most of the troops, but as battles often are, everything was quite a wild mess. And in the confusion, his cavalry either lost heart or mistook an order that he gave them and began to gallop off. In vain, Martin cried after them to stop. He even stepped in their way to bar the path, and was almost trodden down by the tearing flying hooves. They disappeared in a cloud of dust, taking all his hopes of being able to stand against the Texans with them. A white flag went up from the walls of the Alamo. The Mexicans were ready to surrender. The firing stopped, and cheers went up from Milam's men. They had just taken the largest Mexican stronghold in Texas. Martin and his soldiers were given honorable terms. They were allowed to keep their weapons to protect themselves on their journey back to Mexico. Before they left, Martin swore that he would never again fight against anyone who stood for the Constitution of 1824. In the minds of many of the Texan volunteers, the fall of Bexar meant the end of the war. They slung their rifles across their shoulders, bid hearty farewells to their comrades, and turned their boots for home. Burleson resigned his stressful post as commander, and Frank Johnson stepped up as the leader of the last 400 troops who had stayed behind. Victory for the Texan army didn't mean peace for the province, however. There was more disgraceful infighting breaking out in terms of government. You may remember the meeting of the Texan consultation I told you about in our last episode. That one that Sam Houston had dragged his fellow members to attend. It had been decided there that Texas was standing for federalism and would not put herself under the authority of Mexico again until Santa Anna agreed to return to the Constitution of 1824. Well, the trouble was that not everyone agreed with that decision. A small group of Texans in Goliad actually wrote their own Declaration of Independence. The consultation ignored the declaration, and nothing ever really became of the matter. But there was still bickering about the issue of independence among themselves, and discontent among the people of Texas. Perhaps, they thought, another meeting was in order. A convention this time, with elected delegates. It was set to take place in March of 1836. As things often happen in governments, the solving of a problem served to create further problems. Who exactly would be allowed to vote on delegates to the convention? Could everyone, Tejanos and Texans, vote? Or just Texans? The temporary governor of Texas, Henry Smith, didn't want any Tejanos to have the right to vote. And, yet again, this is another place where we see that the true interest of the Texans was not freedom for mankind. It was eventually agreed that Tejanos could vote, but only if they were Federalist. Any Tejanos that had centralist leanings were denied that right. But that wasn't all. Then there was the issue of the recently arrived volunteers from America. Would it be right for them to have a say in the matter of independence? The consultation said no, but that didn't stop it from happening. When a judge refused to allow a band from Kentucky to cast their ballots, the troops pulled out their weapons and threatened to hurt him. They had come to fight for Texas, and they felt they had a say in why they were doing so. They got their votes in that day. And speaking of troops, you might be wondering what the need was for them at this point. Hadn't the fall of Bexar been enough? Well, just because the Texans had driven the Mexicans out didn't mean that they couldn't come back. Santa Anna wasn't the kind of man to give up that easily. It was only a matter of time before a counterattack was launched. They needed to get aggressive, take the fight to him before he took it back to them. And plans for that were already underway.